Hey, thanks for coming out today. Appreciate it. Good to see you guys. So just wanted to give a little explanation of what we're doing today and why we're doing it, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Trentham. As I would imagine you know from being around me and around our PhD program, I care a lot about teaching, excellence in pedagogy, and pursuing that myself. And also a big part of that then is that I really want to help you all learn to be good teachers. I've mentioned this many times, but it's appropriate to mention here again. A few years ago, I was able to work on a grant, to get a grant through the Wabash Center, where we invited back several of our PhD grads who were now teaching, like Luke Stamps and a bunch of people that are teaching now, and asked them the very specific question, how did we do in preparing you to teach? And the universal answer was, we got a good education here. Like, we learned a lot about our content and felt like, you know, we were guided well and mentored well, but I was not prepared to teach, and especially to teach undergraduates, because it's really easy. I'll speak for all of the graduate school colleagues here. We're very spoiled to get to teach, especially those of us who only teach at the MDiv and PhD level. That's not real teaching, right? Undergraduate teaching is where you actually have to be a decent teacher. At the graduate level, you can just be really smart and say a bunch of stuff, and everybody's still just going to praise you and think you're awesome, right? And you don't have to actually be good at being a teacher. But undergraduate professors, they actually have to really think about the art and craft of teaching, or else they probably won't get hired, and then they also probably won't do well or survive. And of course, most of our students, like you, go on not to teach at graduate schools. You go on to teach in undergraduate situations just because there's a lot more of those available. And so that was the first wake-up call for me that, oh, we need to get out of the seminary bubble of just thinking that, you know, everybody wants to have this high-level conversation all the time about the things that we're interested in, right? So that was the beginning for me of stepping towards a little bit more intentionality of trying to do things pedagogically for us here. We've done a few things, you know, there's always more to do. But starting this fall, we are taking a big step forward on that, and we're calling it the Pedagogical Initiative. There was a handout there on the table. And basically, the idea is, as I may have mentioned already, another day, we are going to work on having every one of our PhD students in coursework in our residential programs to be in a classroom at least once a semester to do a little teaching. Ideally, it'd be more than that, but we have to start somewhere. And we're kind of soft launching in the fall, where we're not requiring professors to do this, but in the spring, we're going to require that all supervisors have, and we'll say from the student perspective, that every student have an opportunity to teach for at least 20 minutes in some class, either at Boyce or at the seminary, and then be evaluated on that as well. Which maybe that sounds scary to you, but I would imagine most of you are happy for that opportunity. Now, again, even those of you who are serving as TAs and OTAs, that's a great service, but you may occasionally get called upon for like subbing in teaching, but again, you just be there by yourself at that point, right? You're probably not going to be evaluated for that. We really want to give you some small way, at least, every semester where you can be in front of the classroom, and then you get an evaluation from your supervisor, or if it's some other professor that you're filling in for. So there's a little detail on that. We'll say more about it later. We've created a rubric for you to be evaluated on. And so ideally, you know, that'll be happening every semester for your whole time in coursework. Am I missing anything? I was just around.
One club.
Yeah.
Pedagogy club.
Right. And then the other part of it is that we're also going to dedicate one club session per semester to the issue of pedagogy and teaching excellence. Okay. And that's today. So that's what we're doing today. We'll do this going on. Yeah.
One more thing. The mechanism for recording that you've taught and received a rubric is going to be through Colloquium. So you'll have an assignment portal in your Colloquium that you'll upload that at the end of the semester. So yeah. So we make sure everybody's doing it.
That's for your sake, and I mean, it's just to make sure the professors really do it as well, right? We want to make sure that you really get that attention. And so the one club per semester now is going to be more like a workshop. Probably we'll probably bring in different speakers, and also because everybody in coursework will be teaching, we'll use that club time for you to kind of reflect and share experiences with each other and maybe learn some pro tips and try and give you some ideas of things to try out when you're teaching in class. So that's the idea. I hope that's a positive announcement to you guys. It really comes from my heart of a desire to help you develop more as a teacher. That's really the desire for it. So today is our first time, and I asked the always wonderful Dr. John David Trentham to join me, and we're both going to do about a 20-minute presentation on things on pedagogy. I'll let you tell your own title, and I'm going to let him go first, and then I'll speak for a little bit, and then we'll just open it up for some Q&A as well. So welcome, glad you're here.
Very good to be here. There you go. I forgot to give one of these. I was passing them around. Unfortunately, I have it right here. It's good to be with you. I'm John David Trentham. I go by John David. Around here, I go by Dr. Trentham. In formal context, students and so forth. I serve as a professor here on, I think, every possible level. Bachelor's, master's, professional doctoral, research doctoral. I direct one of our research doctoral programs, which is the Doctor of Education program, which none of you are a part of, but you should know about. And then I serve as the Dean of Students, which is always an exciting job. The Office of Student Life, I'm tasked with keeping our students alive, and they're all alive today.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
So my job is currently going pretty well with that, but really thankful to be able to talk to you today about pedagogy, because this is such an area of emphasis for me personally, vocationally. When I'm asked to do 20 minutes or 25 or 35 or 45, what was it again? On
First rule of pedagogy.
yeah, exactly. on pedagogy, it's a really tall task. It's kind of like the preacher who's like, I can start an hour sermon right now, but if you want me to give a 5-minute homily, I'm going to need a couple of days to prepare. So this is a massive topic, and I was thinking, okay, well, what should I do? What should I present? And given that this is kind of the introductory level of this emphasis, particularly in the 1892 Club and our PhD program, I thought about giving you a primer or some general priorities and principles, but since I wasn't confident that I would really adequately generalize everything, I figured I would just give you some stuff on pedagogy. So that's what you have in your handout, is some stuff. And I'm pretty confident that I have provided some stuff on pedagogy. And right,
Appropriate expectations.
right, exactly. Right. I'm setting the bar. So I've got a few. I'm just going to walk through several of these, and hopefully maybe have a couple of minutes for some questions or clarifications. I really just wanted to distill some of these things in a few major categories on pedagogy, just as a way of prompting your thinking on perhaps on a deeper level than you have thought about the nature of pedagogy and our intentionality in pedagogy, maybe on a deeper level than you have before. So first, some truisms. Pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. It is everything that is involved in the method and practice of teaching. Teaching is facilitating learning. If learning is not being accomplished, then effective teaching is not being accomplished. Effective teachers facilitate learning. Ineffective teachers do not facilitate learning. Teaching is therefore not merely distillation of content or dispensation of content or delivery of information, although it is all of those things. But it is all of those things for the purpose of facilitating learning. Learning is facilitated in every aspect of a course. Pedagogy is your methods of classroom instruction, real-time classroom instruction. It is also every single other aspect of the learning experience that takes place in whatever course that you teach. So, not a rhetorical question, what are those? What are those aspects of a course?
Putting together your
Assignments,
Syllabus, assignments,
reading.
readings, right, textbooks, assessments, very good, yeah. Discussions. extemporaneous discussions, guided discussions, Q&A discussions, open discussions, group discussion, whatever that might be. Exactly right. The list that I came up with this morning off the cuff was readings, classroom practices or classroom liturgy, class structure, class setting, dialogue, Q&A, extemporaneous discussion, guided discussion, assignments, feedback, so on and so forth. All of these are intrinsic to your pedagogy. So it is what you're standing in front of the class and executing. That is pedagogy, but it's also everything else that prompts students to learn and that facilitates learning in your class. So the last truism, to the extent that you intentionally facilitate learning in every aspect of the course design and experience, you will be an effective pedagogue or andragogue. Andragogy, of course, is the study of adult learning. And so when we're thinking in this context, we're thinking about how adults learn in particular. College students are considered adults in formal educational studies. So we'll just let that go. All right, some quotes. First of all, a book that I require all of my boys' college students and undergrad students, wherever I teach, to read, because it's both very basic, very eminently readable, and profound, is Howie Hendricks' book, Teaching to Change Lives. One of the quotations that you should know from that is, we test the effectiveness of your teaching not by what you do, but by what the student does as a result of what you do. Again, speaking back to the truism that teaching is facilitating learning. Okay, so it's not just a matter of what you're doing, not just a matter of what you're executing, not just a matter of what you know as the teacher, but how it is that you're packaging what it is that you know and the content that you're delivering in all aspects of the course so that students are given the best opportunity to learn and grow. Mark Edmondson, a colorful professor and writer at the University of Virginia, says, "My students, alas, usually lack the confidence to acknowledge what would be their most precious asset for learning, their ignorance." What do you suppose he means by that?
If you don't think you need to learn anything, you won't learn anything.
That's right. Our classrooms and our courses have to be a context in which it's safe to learn new things. We don't have to do that by abandoning our confessional priorities and confessional standards. That's good. Raymond Blodkowski, who you should know on the basis of just the coolness of his name alone, feedback is probably the most powerful communication that instructors and peers can regularly use to affect learners' confidence. I'll come back to this at the end of the notes here. There is nothing that you do as an instructor or a professor of a course that can strip the motivation out of your students more than not providing substantive and timely feedback. That's the single thing that studies in higher education, student formation, college student development, that's the single thing with regard to pedagogy and course design. It's always one of the primary takeaways, is that professors, instructors, teachers who do not provide substantive feedback and timely feedback are not effective teachers. And they reduce students' motivation to actually engage in learning. John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, a man who has been trained to think upon one subject or for one subject only will never be a good judge, even in that one. I put this one here because, as Mark Knoll says, we're in an environment here in theological education. One of our pretty much American inventions is that we've kind of separated theological education away from the rest of the academy. We tend to be myopic in our focus on one discipline to that sometimes disparagement even of the other disciplines, or perhaps our ignorance of the other disciplines. And we have to be careful to avoid that. And be careful that we don't prompt that even within our students. We don't need no thought control, Roger Waters. When I showed this to Bethel Bumanglag, she works with me in student life and is also a doctor of education student. I had her look over this real quick. She thought that was the most profound quotation in the whole thing. And then she just asked me who Roger Waters was, which then I thought was profound. I was like, wow, because I kind of put it on here as a little bit of a clever device. But anyway, Roger Waters, we don't need no thought control. So, of course, the way that applies here is that your job as a teacher is not to think thoughts for students. Your job is to facilitate learning, right? Some place to start. Again, Howie Hendricks' book, it's not the last word on teaching and pedagogy. It's primarily oriented toward teaching, the teaching ministry of the church, you would probably say. But he has 7 laws. These are a good place to start, at least. 7 laws. The law of the teacher: if you stop growing today, you stop teaching tomorrow. So how is it as a teacher that your students are not only prompted to learn and grow and develop and mature, but how is it that they see and hear you demonstrating a life of growing and learning, maturing, and developing? The law of education is that the way people learn determines how you teach. Read, this is not about learning styles. I'll come back to this mythological notion of learning styles in a few minutes. But the way to facilitate learning is to engage your students by thinking about how could they best learn this. Our methodology in teaching, our methodology in pedagogy should be oriented around whatever method gives students the best opportunity to learn, because teaching is facilitating learning. That does not mean appealing to learning styles. The law of activity is that maximum learning is always the result of maximum involvement, a call to active learning. Students need to be active and engaged in the learning process in every aspect of your course. So that not only includes classroom dialogue in real time, it also includes reading, it also includes outside of class learning activities, whatever other activities are involved, or learning tasks, whatever other learning tasks are involved. The law of communication, this one's in the middle because it's most important. Communication is the reason for our existence as teachers. It's also our #1 problem. To truly impart information requires the building of bridges, and by that he means to students' thoughts, feelings, and actions, intellect, affect, and volition. The law of the heart, teaching that impacts is not head-to-head but heart-to-heart. Essentially the same thing as the law of fleshing out the law of communication. Then the law of encouragement, teaching tends to be most effective when the learner is properly motivated. I don't know why there's a question mark there. That should be a period. It's a declarative sentence. The answer to the question.
It was a very engaging.
That's right. Yeah, this is the only one that I call into question. No. The learner needs to be properly motivated. So a more academic text that I refer to at the bottom is Vlodkowski's book, Enhancing Learners' Motivation to Learn. That's one you should definitely have on your shelf. Research-based best practices in enhancing student motivation. And then the law of readiness. The teaching learning process will be most effective when student and teacher are adequately prepared. If students are showing up to your class and they don't know really what's going on, there's no narrative arc to your class, and they're not adequately prepared to really engage with you, but then you just launch into whatever it is that you're talking about that day, you need to understand that it's going to take students a while to acclimate to even what you're talking about. That's not the only way that the law of readiness applies, but it's one important way. Okay, some research-based conclusions or observations. This is from Ken Bain's book, another one that is absolutely essential. This was a Lilly-funded proper research study that was done on pedagogy and pedagogical methods from a massive sampling of college teachers. And these are his 6 takeaways about the best college teachers. Outstanding teachers know their subjects extremely well. Period. End of commentary. Number 2, exceptional teachers treat their lectures, discussion sections, problem-based sessions, and other elements of teaching as serious intellectual endeavors as intellectually demanding and important as their research and scholarship. One of the points that David Smith and Jamie Smith make in their book, Teaching Christian Practices, is that in the history of Christian higher education in particular, we have focused most, if not almost all of our intentionality and pedagogy on critical thinking methods and processes and so forth. And then the research and scholarship, the kind of cutting edgeness of our research and scholarship in doing that. And this is simply just a call to the fact that we need to be thinking about not only the precision of the content that we are offering to students, but the nature in which we're packaging it, their readiness to learn it, how it is that it's the most relevant thing that they should learn. Why should it be part of the explicit curriculum in your course, and that sort of thing. The best teachers, number 3, expect more. Whatever bar you set, whatever reasonable bar of expectation you set for your students, they will tend to reach it. However low you set the bar, that's about as high as students will tend to go. The best teachers expect more. Number 4, the best teachers create an environment in which people learn by confronting intriguing, beautiful, or important problems, authentic tasks that will challenge them to grapple with ideas, rethink their assumptions, and examine their mental paradigms. A call here to the nature of teaching as prompting an internal activity, a process of reflection, and even an ethic of reflection in students, rather than merely a gathering of correct data. Number 5, highly effective teachers tend to reflect a strong trust in students. They usually believe that students want to learn, and they assume, until proven otherwise, that they can. Number 6, all the best teachers have some systematic program to assess their own efforts and to make appropriate changes. Institutional methods of pedagogical feedback are generally lacking in formative substance for teachers. They're not rubbish, but they really don't tend to give you a very accurate picture of your effectiveness as a teacher in terms of how you're actually prompting students to be self-motivated and to engage in learning. All the best teachers have some systematic program to assess their own efforts and to make appropriate changes. So moving into the questions to consider, and then some things to remember. Thinking specifically about that number 6, one of the things that I would just emphasize is, and I think I have the question, it's the second to last one. How do you ensure to obtain authentic feedback and evaluation of your teaching? There are multiple ways to do that. But I'm just going to say, suffice to say here, you should not rely on whatever student evaluation form is compulsory to give you the feedback that you need in terms of what you need to do in order to increase your effectiveness as a teacher. Ask student questions about what they're learning. I tend to do a capstone assignment in my course where I'll point students back to the learning objectives in the course and explain how it is, or to what extent, for each learning objective, how it is that they learned and grew and deepened in their whatever understanding or application, whatever the learning objective was. So I'm going to suggest that the best way to get real, genuine, authentic feedback in terms of your effectiveness and where you need to grow and develop in your pedagogy is from the students themselves. And there are a lot of ways to do that. So some questions. How do different students experience learning in your class or course? Are you aware of those students to whom you tend to communicate effectively and those to whom you tend to struggle to communicate effectively with? Do you care who the students are who you tend not to communicate naturally with? Are you thinking about how it is not only that you're giving accurate and faithful information and content, but how it is that the students are experiencing the class, every aspect of the class? What barriers are there in place? What intellectual virtues are you stoking on purpose through the design and practice of your teaching? What are some of the intellectual virtues that we would want to stoke? What's one intellectual virtue that we would hope to? Okay, good. Critical thinking. What else? Humility, right. Devotion. Discipline. Good, yeah. On and on and on. So the off-the-cuff list that I made this morning was intellectual integrity, intellectual curiosity, intellectual honesty, intellectual humility, precision, reflection, reflective judgment, multidisciplinary awareness, and so forth. How are you on purpose stoking these intellectual virtues through the design and the practice of your teaching? Doesn't mean we need to be overly clever and like have a section of every class we teach or every course we teach. We're like, okay, well, this is the intellectual humility part of the course, and but we need to be thinking about that. What pedagogical tropes or assumptions do you tend to rely on to the potential detriment of your teaching? Can anybody share from experience maybe a trope that professors might rely on just maybe by habit that isn't very effective in one context or another? All professors.
What do you mean by trope? Like
Yeah,
saying or action or?
Yeah, trope. Yeah, not only a saying, but conventional. Yeah,
Practice.
conventional wisdom, conventional assumption.
So like lecture is the primary means of teaching.
Or the only.
Yeah.
Or the only way to distill content or whatever. That doesn't make us anti-lecture. It just makes us reflective of, okay, well, is this the best way to prompt students to learn what I'm wanting them to learn? Is that the best way to accomplish the objective that I have in what I want students to gain? So we need to be aware of those. We all tend to teach. Our methods for teaching tend to be those, like everything else, that is a product of our backgrounds and the awarenesses that we've gained, for better or worse, in our own educational experiences and so forth. How do you ensure to obtain authentic feedback? We already talked about that. And then what's the pedagogical purpose of assignment feedback? I mentioned that already as well. The nature of feedback, also known as grading in most contexts, as a formative aspect of your pedagogy. Some things to remember. To the extent you're able, give students the opportunity to consider and articulate what they already know about the topic or issue at hand, why it's relevant and important to them, and what or how they hope to grow, to gain or grow. A student, especially adult students, we're talking about andragogy here, adult students always learn better when they understand or appreciate the relevance of whatever the topic is for them personally or their context, or how it is, and then how it is that they hope to grow, what they hope to gain, whether it's a whole course or a particular session or whatever. So give students that opportunity. Our doctrine is not merely propositionalist, neither should our teaching be. Neither should our course content be. Again, we're facilitating learning, not merely distilling content. Never underestimate the power of provocative questions. Ken Bain and Stephen Brookfield, two of the titans in higher education pedagogy practices in terms of published authors, always come back to this, that the greatest teachers are those who craft the best questions, provocative questions. The basic notion of learning styles is not a myth. The notion that each student learns best exclusively through their preferred style is. There is no evidence that matching a learning activity to a student's preferred style improves learning. We hear about learning styles in any number of different ways. We hear about it a lot. It is a trope. It is a conventional wisdom that has never been shown through research to be reality. This notion that we need to figure out the preferred learning style of each of our students, and then we need to give them the opportunity to learn in that style. That's from Kolb, this guy Kolb, K-O-L-B. This is the kind of notion. So if you're a visual learner, you need to be given the opportunity to learn visually rather than auditorily or another way. That's a myth. That has never been shown to be accurate. Are there learning styles? Yes. But what we need to think about in terms of learning styles is what style is going to most befit what I want students to learn, not how is it that I can appeal cleverly to individual learning styles. That's never been shown to be significant in the learning process. Yes, Dominic.
Trentham, I would like to kindly challenge that last point, if I can do anything kindly. That is that it is not necessarily the responsibility of the teacher to adapt to the learning style of the student. First of all, it would be very difficult to do any type of qualitative research to put into boxes what a learning style is. So there's so many factors. There's ethnic factors, language factors. There's how much TV students watch. All of these types of things that influence what we would call a learning style. And the second thing is that what you're saying, to a certain extent, at least to my ears, and I say this politely, sort of sounds like a trope, which says we do not need to do things that are developmentally appropriate for our students in individual circumstances. What we need to do is we need to make sure that they're getting what we're trying to get across, and that they're ultimately able to demonstrate that, and that will justify the means. Now, I don't think you're exactly saying that, because I've been listening to the rest of that, which you've been saying, and I'm sort of exaggerating what I'm hearing. But I just wanted to challenge that, because I think that generationally, there are certain characteristics that feed into individual styles, that there are sort of Venn diagrams with like generation, and this generation sort of likes to do this type of thing. And then there are ways that professors can adapt their styles to different types of students. That's sort of what I think. I don't know if you have any comments.
I don't even disagree with anything that you just said.
Maybe
But
I'm misunderstanding.
right, what you're describing is not properly in the actual educational vernacular. What is the claim of learning styles? The claim of the common notion of learning styles is that we need to figure out what each individual in our classroom, whatever his or her individual learning styles are, and then we need to cleverly devise each learning activity so that it can be accomplished through whatever discrete individual learning styles are present in our classroom. What you're describing is just being attentive and intentional in fashioning the way that you communicate in light of who your students are, and being just sensitive and conscientious. So what you just described, I don't even disagree with at all. I'm only challenging, in fact, I'm not even challenging it. It's never been shown to, the huge claims about learning styles in terms of we need to appeal to individuals in our classrooms, and on an individual level.
Individual education plan, IEPs, that people do. But that mostly relates to people with disabilities in their life.
Right. That's on kind of an even deeper level, because that's more of a developmental issue. So yeah, what you're describing, I wouldn't even challenge.
Thank you for giving me if I misunderstood.
Yep. Okay. Yep. This is the last point. Adult learners always report that timely and substantive feedback either propels or stymies their motivation to learn. I put some things to read there. These are just things that I saw on my shelf when I glanced at it this morning that I would definitely commend to you. And I'm happy to, if you want to stop by, I can show you any of these. And thanks for your time. Yeah.
I don't think we'll take questions at this point. Hopefully we can. So here's a handout coming around real quickly. And thank you, John. For my time with you briefly here, I have two buckets of ideas. I want to cast some vision for you of pedagogy, and then I also want to give you some pro tips, and in the sense just some things I've learned, gathered from other places and from my own experience. But I want to start with this. I want you to take just a minute and write some bullet point answers to this. When you think about a great teacher that you've learned from, what made their teaching good and lasting impact? So I want you to get out a pen and write down the answer to that. That's what the question is on the handout. Just a couple bullet points is fine. Maybe you can think of somebody specifically, probably is the best way to do it. But why would you describe someone who was a good teacher? Just take about 30 seconds to do that. Yeah, just looking for bullet points. Curious, a few people hear from you. What'd you jot down? You think about a teacher who's had an impact that you think was very effective. Why? What was it?
For me, the embodiment of what they teach.
What do you mean by that?
I don't feel like it's just that they knowledge, but they embody themselves about it.
Okay, so do you mean by that they seem to have experience of what they're talking about? The
They're passionate about it. And they're
convictions about it as well. Okay, good. Some other people.
I put two things. The first, my relationship with that person,
Okay.
the relational aspect, and secondly, those who are able to communicate even the difficult ideas or concept into a simple ways.
Okay, so communication ability and the relationship. Okay, great. Thanks. Others, yeah.
I'd put like an uncommon depth. A lot of times people will say, if you're going to teach on something, you kind of assume to some degree a surface level answer. And when the teacher challenges what your initial thoughts might be and brings an uncommon depth or an unexpected thought or idea, to me that is super engaging.
Okay, yeah. So you feel like, oh, I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah,
You really
like
learned
new
something.
insights like that. I would have not thought of that. I was kind of judging you beforehand. But
Right.
kind of
Me
curious
personally?
that-
Or-
No.
Okay.
No, like you think, well, I've got to answer that.
Yeah,
But then, so you kind of superficially, thought through the content as they peer through that.
Yeah, that's great. And a sermon, please. Couple more. Nice. You two guys just stuck out there.
When,
Not just pass it out. Go around. Couple others? Yeah.
when they make me think about how I'm thinking, not just what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Just a time tell me why they're teaching.
Okay.
Not just like kind of put it in a broader context rather than just getting it really fast.
Okay. Good. Good more, Rocco.
I mean, so discussion-based class can be a little bit tricky. It can be really bad or really good. So Socratic discussion that really focuses on the primary text.
Okay.
So you're really engaging at a deeper level. The professor has a really good knowledge of the primary text.
So, okay, good. Some things I put down, those are all great. We can put some others as well. I just jotted down knowledge that they really know what they're talking about, right? That they're interesting as a person, which I guess would include maybe good communication and maybe also the idea of someone who can think outside of just downloading data, like they may be connecting it to other fields of study and other things else, and that they cared and they're kind, right? Those are just some I jotted down quickly as well. So, okay, well, what I want to do, so now my last point is what's happening right now, which is when you give a handout out, teaching ends, which is okay. I knew what I was doing here, and that's okay. So be aware that if you look at the very last point on the back page, it says careful use of handouts or something like that, right? So be aware, I'm not judging you, not shaming you, we're all doing the natural thing. But I also have limited time and wanted to get this in your hands. What I want to talk about for a few minutes is some vision casting, which I've given you 4 points there, and then some pro tips. So if you'll stay on the front page with me and just say something about this kind of vision casting for what I've experienced over the last 20 years or so of teaching in various capacities or more. First point I want to make, did you get one? Sorry, is I'm calling, and each of these are just mental hooks to hang some ideas on for you, and they each have a progression in them. So the idea is that I want you to be thinking of making a step from where you are to the next stage of your development as a teacher. So each of these just invite you on a journey. Okay, it's a dynamic reality. It's not just an ideal. It's the next stage. So here's the first step to take. From teaching as being just natural to intentional. Most of you here, I would imagine, are probably decent teachers and will continue to grow as such. If you're not naturally good enough, that may prove, if you're naturally good enough, that'll be sufficient probably for you to get a job, or would be necessary for you to get a job. And you'll probably be reasonably successful, even if you have some kind of natural teaching ability in you and have enough experience. But I want to challenge you, wherever you are on the natural ability of the teaching, that all of us should go from being just natural teachers to being really intentional teachers. And I mean by that if maybe you're not the most naturally gifted person, that means it's really necessary that you do this. But even if you are a particularly natural teacher, I want to challenge all of you to say that if we're going to be excellent, then we really have to be conscious of improving our lives as teachers. That's one of the biggest things I want to push you on. Probably to this point in your life, you are here and you've had teaching experiences because you're good enough. And you probably haven't thought much about the actual art and craft of teaching, right? And you're good enough and you've gotten by, or else you wouldn't be in this place. I'm just going to say that is not enough. That's not enough, not only really for a long-term career, but it's also not enough in terms of just goodness and rightness and beauty, that you really need to be very intentional about it, because all of what we have, including the area of teaching, is always a combination of both gifting and diligence, right? The gifting and diligence are always, the excellence is a function of both of those realities. Some of us have a lot of gifting, and especially if you're in that case, it'll be really easy to be lazy and not be intentional, right? But all the more, to whom much is given, much is required. You especially, those of you who are particularly gifted, need to add to your gifting diligence. So first move is from natural to intentional. Second, from teacher to mentor, and this relates to a lot of the great things Dr. Trentham was saying as well. Students, and these are thoughts that come from William, so whatever this Dutch or this Polish name is, Deresiewicz, whatever it is. This was a guy who taught, I think, at Yale for a little while. I don't know what happened exactly, but he basically became disillusioned with how a lot of education has happened in America. And his argument is, I don't know if you know this book, or I think you probably know more about than I do. But the idea is that just recognizing that students really crave mentorship from their teachers, and that's not wrong. That's actually entirely natural. That's what teaching, I'd say, as a Christian, we especially want to say that. And so that means all the things Dr. Trentham is saying about crafting a classroom, et cetera, but that especially that if you're just thinking about it, even if there's an office on campus of student life or some kind of ways that help with mentoring, especially thinking in an undergraduate situation, the reality is students really gravitate towards teachers with whom they forged a connection. And because learning is such a deeply emotional experience, and again, the challenge to us is that we tend to think of learning, we don't think of learning, we think about teaching as downloading content to people, right? But the reality is it is a deeply emotional, relational experience. And so just to kind of step towards that and recognize that this is the greatest thing you have to offer as a teacher is your very self. Let me quote this guy. He says, "For all the skill that teaching involves, you ultimately have a single tool, your entire life as you've lived it up until the moment you walk into that class. The teacher, that professional amateur, teaches not so much his subject as himself. he provides a model of one in whom what seemed dead, mere print on the page, becomes living, a way of life, right? Here's something that's really disturbing for me to hear, because I like Mortimer Adler. Saul Bellow, who had Mortimer Adler, was, you know, he was a very famous head of the University of Chicago and the Great Books program and all these kind of things. Saul Bellow had him as a student, and he said, Mortimer Adler had much to tell us about Aristotle's ethics, but I had only to look at him to see that he had nothing useful to offer on the conduct of life, right? So I don't know if that's fair of Adler or Bellow or not, but either way, may it not be true of us, that somebody could say, well, that guy, professor, whoever, knows a lot about stuff, but I don't really want to model my life on them, or don't really have a lot to learn about life from them. If that's people's evaluation of you, then you're not a teacher. You're a purveyor or a downloader of content. So I just want to cast this vision for you that this, you know, to go from thinking of your role as being a teacher to really what you're doing through expertise in content is you're mentoring people through emotional relationship with them. From the scientific to the poetic. Another reference, another book, James Taylor, not the famous musician, but James Taylor is a Catholic thinker, Poetic Knowledge, the Recovery of Education. He talks about, which is a very old tradition in Europe, the 4 modes of knowing: metaphysical, scientific, rhetorical, and poetic. And his point is in this, that basically we need to recognize that really at the core and maybe the beginning of learning is something that we don't think much about anymore in this post-enlightenment age, and that is the good and the beautiful. And that what really motivates learning, and really is at the heart of learning and the gateway into learning, is this mysterious, incalculable, not quantifiable sense of the good and the beautiful. And we've lost that. Let me find the quote here for you. We do not begin education by instructing the intellect, at least the rational intellect, but as Socrates points out in the Republic, we begin education by exposing the soul's sensory and emotional faculties to the things that are beautiful, true, and good. Now, that's for sure true of children, right? And there's no doubt, but I would suggest to you, even in adult learning and with, you know, a lot of the concrete's a lot harder in an adult learning than it is in a child, but still, if you can adopt in yourself the mindset that when you are teaching X class, both an individual classroom as well as a whole course, your goal is not just to give them scientific information about the content of that class, but to really give them the most important kind of knowledge, which is poetic knowledge. That is the sense of the good and the beautiful and the true. And again, that's, you know, I can't give you a scientific way to do that. That's the point. It has to do with who you are as a person in so many ways. But I just want to cast this vision for you to say, that's part of your job as a teacher, is to expose people in this, not irrational way, but this kind of pre-rational way to the good and the beautiful. And if you don't do that, you won't be very effective. But on the positive side, if you do, you will be very effective. And the last one here for vision casting, from the lecture, and they don't really need that definite article there, sorry, from lecture prep to what I'm calling CCD, content crafting and delivery. So what makes beautiful, excellent, and effective teaching and preaching, I would say, is a focus on all 3 of these elements: the content, the substantive material that you know and you're communicating, the crafting, though, of how you, and putting energy into what kind of lectures you give and the language you use and the metaphors you use and the poetic sensibilities, things like arranging the physical space of the classroom, all those kind of things are part of the crafting. And then the delivery, and here I would again just emphasize again your presence as a person, your joy, your intellectual virtues, your excitement, being a real person who cares about them. And my point in this is that, unfortunately, I think we as teachers, especially those of us who are at this level of education, primarily think of teaching in terms of just the first C, the content. And we think if we can be really knowledgeable, maybe we have a little crafting, we listen to something like this and go, okay, I'm going to try to do that next time. Okay. Maybe a tiny bit of crafting, right? But I'm suggesting to you that you need to give equal energy to all of these aspects to make excellent teaching. Yes, knowledge of the content, also the crafting of that content in terms of again, metaphors and language and beauty in that, and then also the delivery as well. And if you can give energy to all three of those, I think you'll find your teaching will improve greatly. And our struggle again is that I think almost always we concentrate on that first part. So flip over then, some pro tips. I mean by this, the reality is that real knowledge comes through personal experience, but the second best thing to personal experience is someone who has the experience themselves and put their arm around you and help you. So I have a car guy in my life from my church, Shelby May, who grew up on a farm, and he could fix anything. He just loves to use his hands to get in there and fix engines. And so I don't want him to do this stuff for me. I want to learn too. So I go over to his house. I bring cars over there. He's taught me how to do brakes. He's taught me how to do various things, right? We did the clutch on my RX-8, right? I did part of it. He had to do the harder part of it, right? But now I feel a little bit more confident. We fix something else. Now my wife's car is acting up. So this week I'm going to jack it up and get under there and mess with those O2 sensors. I feel more confident to do that just because I've seen him do it on my cars as well. So this is what I'm saying to you. I don't have all the answers, but I've been teaching a little bit longer than most of you and have experienced some success in these things. So here's some pro tips, put my arm around you to help you think about some things. First of all, it's good to start with an open writing experience, like we did, right? I love to get very meta. That's how we started this thing as well. I do this in almost every classroom, and it's good. You have to write a good prompt because it helps students go from passive to active learning. We could have spent a lot more time, if we had more time, hearing your answers, and I could have explored that more. It would not be a bad class if you spent 20 or 25 minutes at the beginning of the class just dialoguing with students about what the prompt was. I guarantee you the effectiveness of that learning is going to be more than all this single space 12-point lecture material that you're hoping to download to them. I guarantee you that you will be more effective if you were going to give space in class to that kind of discussion. So, yep.
Is that, you usually have that something that you've covered in a previous class related to that, or something coming up?
Usually coming up. I usually use it as
Okay.
because this is what we're going to talk about and I want to get going. And again, I know everything in us is thinking, I've got all this material I need to communicate. Well, if you got all this material you need to communicate, or as I often say to young preachers as well, if you go into the pulpit with 38 points, you know how many they come away with? 0, right? So if you got too many points, you're actually going to be counterproductive. So I'm encouraging you don't spend less time in your content development, but maybe you do have to spend less time on it and spend more time on the crafting and delivery and a writing prompt, and then spending time in class working on it is a good way to do that.
Can I just mention responding to this as well, that this really corresponds to the first point I made under the giving students the opportunity to literally articulate, write down what they're bringing to the table. Because adult learners know something about whatever you're going to talk about. They know something about it on some level. And giving them the opportunity to articulate that engages them in learning so that they don't just have to abstractly find their way into tracking along with you. So, yeah.
That's good. I didn't have time to do this, but another great thing I like to do is I often will have students physically draw out some idea, right? So, for example, I could have you, it was what I was going to do, but it's the problem, to turn the paper over and say, okay, I'd like you to draw out a simple picture of what your relationship, or I'm sorry, what your role as a teacher is. And just leave it open and let them draw out the relationship of, and we'll just see, it's just curious. And because doing it activates the other part of your brain, and it doesn't have to be an elaborate, shaded oil painting or something. I just mean, showing out spatial relationships and bringing it in, and then again, spending some time talking about those things, what people have come up with in class. Some of you have had me for higher ed already. I do one of these in higher ed, and will again. And what I often do is have them airdrop them to me and then project them, and then ask the people to share what they've done. Some of you remember we did that. Like, I think the exercise is, what is your relationship to the academy and the church? How do you draw yourself in a relationship to the academy and the church? And not just to bullet point it out, but actually draw it out. And it's simple, it can be simple. That really, it can be very helpful. Here's another little pro tip. Today we will, that is even just write on the board, the class agenda, like what we're going to be talking about today, and maybe the sequence of things we're going to be talking about. that's really helpful. And that's just a basic thing to do that you can, if you get to the classroom, and I'm not perfect on this either, but one of the things I've learned from James Lang's excellent book, Small Teaching, you know, you should not be the last one coming into a classroom. And I'm guilty of this at times too, I get it. But you should be in the classroom, ready to go, so that you can start teaching, right? Not that you're rushing in, you know, you can picture the crazy professor, papers are flying out. Okay, that's fine. We won't think of any weird Kramer. But yeah, the Kramer, which we've got a great Kramer too around here, and they're wonderful, right? But generally, it's probably more effective for us mere mortals as teachers to get to class beforehand and write on the board, here's what we're talking about today, right? And even here's the steps of what we were going to talk about. It'll take you 5 minutes. I guarantee you that will make a world of difference in the effectiveness of your teaching, right? You would want that. You'd benefit from that, right? So another is having a class mantra. So in addition to my life here, most of you probably know, I also teach a high school music appreciation class every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10:30, which keeps me real and makes a lot of money. So that's the main reason I do it. But one of the things I really enjoy it because it's very web thinking format. I always talk about the history of ideas and how it relates to music, et cetera. But there's a thesis for the entire class that we say every class period, right? So they will go away with this, and that is that art both reflects and affects culture. So that we say at every class period. So I could go in and say, well, you know, what's the class mantra? And they could say art both reflects and affects culture. And then what that means becomes more and more significant to them as we go throughout the semester, right? And or throughout the year, really, where they see it over and over. So if you can think of a mantra for whatever you're trying to do in a class, maybe it's a more complicated one or maybe several of them, that can give a constant framework to your class, what you're doing. Student-produced study guides. Students often ask for study guides. I don't know how to do this exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's probably better ways than I thought of doing this, but instead of producing a student guide for them, have them produce a study guide that then is shared or maybe done in some collaborative way. Dr. Trump probably has some pro tips along that lines. Here's something else I've started doing in my music appreciation class. I call it Make Your Own Quiz. That's what MYOQ is. And so I will have them, after I teach the material for the day, I'll carve out 15 minutes or maybe even only 10 minutes and say, okay, in groups of 3, look over the material and the textbook and what we just talked about and write a good question for next week's quiz on this. And then they go and write them on the board, and I make sure that they're a legitimate question, right? That they relate to it and the answer. And then that's what the bulk of the quiz for the following week is. I mean, it's super effective, right? Because they are invested in making the questions themselves. So there's other tips along those lines you can do. Small teaching experiences in classes, giving students an opportunity to teach something. I also give you the learning pyramid, which is not without some debate. And my colleague here knows more about this stuff than I do, but it's based on some stuff from Edgar Dale and some other people. So, you know, I'm sure it could be applied in an unhelpful way, but the point of this learning pyramid is basically that when students are engaged in more active learning, the retention is much higher, and I think that's indisputable. And so if our goal, as Dr. Trentham was saying, is actually learning, not just teaching, right? And that's the big shift I want you to go. Your goal is not to teach, your goal is to facilitate learning. If that's the truth, then we need to really vary our pedagogical techniques to that end. And this gives some examples of that, period. And on the other hand, I also want to say, along with Alex Hall and many others, that the lecture is not a bad thing, right? Especially at the graduate level. You have a lot of content expertise that you do need to share with people. So I am not anti-lecture at all. It's just that we need to vary and recognize the lecture is not the only, should not do all the heavy labor of teaching. Now, I'm still guilty of that myself because it's a cultural and personal habit kind of thing that you need to change. But what Alex Hall in this Chronicle of Higher Education article says in the defense of the lecture is that part of the advantage of a lecture is that you're modeling, you're not just giving content, because there's actually probably more effective ways you can give content, like reading is more time efficient than lecturing. But what lecturing does in part is you're modeling how to think about things and how to approach them, both with virtues as well as just reasoning. So part of what giving a really good lecture can do is you can excite people. Of course, too, there's the emotional element of it. But you can also really you're modeling how to process something, right? And that's really valuable as well. Here's a little what I call assessment psych out. There's a pro tip from somebody else I got. Instead of giving quizzes, like say giving 10 quizzes and dropping the 2 lowest, how about give 10 quizzes and keep the highest 8, and then actually you can give more quizzes. Like they will be asking you for more quizzes, right? In other words, if they get to keep the highest 10 or keep the highest 8 quizzes, that all that you give, you can end up giving 25 quizzes and you won't get any complaint. In fact, you'll welcome. I thought that was an interesting sort of pro tip to do as well. And then I already said something about using handouts. Last thing then is a closing writing assignment, right? And let's do that. So what I want you to do on the back of the page where I gave you the opening writing assignment, what I want you to do is take about 30 seconds, glance through my handout and Dr. Trentham's handout, and in your own words, write down just 1 or 2 things that you want to take away to work on. Probably not going to change your whole life, either our little presentations are, but is there something that you can just step towards thinking about the next time you're teaching Sunday school or preaching a sermon or teaching in a classroom? What are 1 or 2 things you might want to kind of take away and try to implement? So just take 30 seconds and do that. Okay, now I want you to take a minute and turn to just one other person and pair up and just share those with each other if you would, just to kind of, maybe you'll learn something from them as well.
In your class, but you're also well, basically force you to think about these other things. It would probably make your class much more. I also just talked about the presentation. I think that's really especially like
All right, let me bring us back together here. So if I could grab you back together. So anything from your little discussion that would be helpful to share for others? I just love to hear what you're taking away. Anybody? Anything you're taking away? I'd love to hear. Share with others. I'll say that I need to really look back at my syllabi and practice what I preach on a lot of these things too. Because once the semester starts, you know, it's just easy to cut and paste, change the date. Here we go. I'm busy, you know. And so, you know, I think I've got pretty high natural ability as a teacher, but I really am constantly trying to challenge myself to intentionally, especially in the area of assessment and in classroom time, to really grow in a lot of these areas myself. So, but anybody else have anything you want to share? Yeah, please, Jared.
I think for me, like more meat and potatoes classes, like I really like the idea of a mantra because it helps them to see the long-term vision.
Yeah.
And in those classes, it's particularly to keep that in mind.
Yeah. So something even maybe about learning to read. that
Yeah.
This will save my soul.
Yeah, I'm trying to-
Our beloved Gentry has one. Bury yourself in a lexicon, rise to new life in Christ. That's a mantra that people remember.
I'm not going to think of the specific, but just something to help them see the long-term benefit of something that
Good.
seems so difficult.
That's good, and that'll stick with them. Yeah, excellent. Somebody
Yeah,
else?
get on paper.
Someone else you want to share?
I've always, I feel like I have the best of intentions, and then when it gets to it, I run out of time to do this, but I've always desired to ask, to be better at asking those questions and craft content around for both the semester, but then each individual lecture around a narrative, right? And then to lead folks through these discussions in dialogue. I've always wanted to, but it never ends that way.
That's really good. Yeah, thanks. Okay, one more person. Something else you're taking away?
Craft poetic not only takes time, but time for self-appropriation. Just gotta season like a fine wine, which we know nothing about.
Cheese. Cheese.
The Merlot cheese is the closest we're getting. Merlot de Batona.
Good. All right, well, yeah, please.
Just real quick, could you maybe comment with your years of experience about all of these elements take time, and I feel like the deeper we dive, the more time it takes. Like I feel like it takes a lot of time to work through another Hebrew grammar and try to find another new way to approach something. But then that has nothing to do with how I then craft it and deliver it, which takes even more time. So like, can you speak just quickly to?
I mean, like prep time.
Yeah, like you want to implement all of this stuff, but I can't.
Yeah.
So do you do one at a time? And is that?
And that, yeah, great. I mean, I feel the same way. So I would say this is, again, where small teaching is so great, this idea that, yeah, we can't fix everything. We can't change everything institutionally, as well as like personal things that we can even control, let alone institutional things that we couldn't change, like how the classrooms are built or something. So what do? You do the next thing. You just take small steps towards the better. So don't let the ideal be the enemy of the good. Right? That's the key. So you just say, well, okay, this semester I'm teaching X, and I'm going to try to look at the assessment in all the 3 classes I'm teaching, 4 classes I'm teaching. I'm just going to look at what I'm doing for assessment and try to see if I can maybe make that a little bit more learning centered and not just teaching centered, Or I'm going to use one writing prompt per week, maybe, and be willing to give up 15 minutes of lecture time to facilitate a discussion. That's all I can do this semester or something. That's enough, and play the long game. And that's why I intentionally use the metaphors of from something to, this is a journey. You're learning, you're becoming always a better teacher if you're intentional, right? So to just think of, I'm just take the next step towards what I can do. And I know that's kind of a general answer, but I want to encourage you in that. I mean, you're doing, if you care, you're being intentional. And, I guess the biggest thing I'll end with this is, again, who we are as people in the classroom is the most important thing. If you show up and you're not just stuck in thinking about your material, but you're actually thinking about these as people who need love and kindness and wisdom and grace and joy, that will get you a long ways, right? If you show up as a real person and you can be present with people, then even if you didn't feel like all your prep was what it could or should have been, or even all your improvements in pedagogy could or should have been, if you show up as a real person of love, that will end up being the most effective. And that's something we can all strive towards today. Right. Thank you. Okay. Hey, we appreciate you guys always being here. The club is such a joy. And we hope that, this continued focus on pedagogy will inspire you and help you improve in all areas of your life. And we'll do this once a club. If you ever have any ideas for speakers or workshops or topics related to this, we're very open to that. And again, this semester alone, feel free to ask your supervisor about, all the professors know about this now. They're not required to do it this semester, but you don't be afraid to say to your supervisor, hey, could I get 20 minutes in one of your classes to, take up some of your material or present something you're working on that might be relevant to the class. They're not required to do that this semester, but you can ask, and then we'll officially roll it out in the spring. So that's the plan. So appreciate you guys. Next week, Will Kynes will be, one of our own will be here on screen with us. She'll be excellent. So we'll see you then. Thanks.